Ayégún làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò.
Hello there.
Ayégún làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Ayégún ti dé ọ̀rẹ́ aráyé. Lórí Facebook, lórí YouTube.
Good afternoon to you, good evening to you, and even good morning to you from wherever you are joining me from. It is Mayegun live. I know we are starting very late. I'm just going to get straight to it. So all you have to do is share the broadcast, okay? And if you have the time to sit and engage with the video, great. Most importantly is that if you tune in, you can listen in the background, okay? And I have 2.5 hours to see if we can cover the remaining 40 pages. Yes, 40 pages to end this reading. And we can have conversation around it in the days and weeks and possibly months to come. So I'm just going to go straight into it. So this time around, that the conversation around Biafra, the declaration of the Biafra, as well as the breakup of Nigeria into 12 states, are being announced by both party, Nigeria and the Biafran. So the British parliamentary debates on Biafra, that's what we're going to go into now. Thank you. You can see that I just rushed into it. Anyway, it has to be done. So, as head of the government, Britain had a special interest in preserving the borders of the group's member states. Nigeria was, after all, Britain's creation. Britain had expertly piloted its creation through the various political storms that had threatened its existence, including the North threat to pull out of the nation in the aftermath of the 1953 independence motion crisis. The British Colonial Office had gone further to carefully manage the independence struggle to ensure the succession to power by local leaders of its choosing. With the cooperation of these friendly successors, Britain had been able to exercise continuing influence on key policies and appointments right up to the run-up to the war. Britain had been head of the Nigerian army until February 1965, and another served as Deputy Secretary to Prime Minister Balewa until the time of the January 1966 coup. The fighting started in July 1967. A year later, what it had been predicted would be a quick police operation was now a full-blown bloody war, which was dominating British newspaper headlines. In the House of Commons, the debate on the Biafran War, which took place on 27th August 1968, was reminiscent of the great debate of the 19th century in the same house over the equally emotive issue of abolition. The war was at a critical stage. Azikiwe sat and watched the debate from a seat that had been reserved for him in the cubicle of the sergeant at arms. The choice before the House was whether to compel the federal government to call a ceasefire or to allow it to press ahead with what was expected to be the final push to overwhelm the Biafrans. George Thompson, the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs put the government case thus. The Nigerian forces, like the forces of many Commonwealth countries, were trained and equipped on British lines long before independence. Under successive British governments, they have naturally looked largely to us for resupply. When the time came that they most needed supplies, they counted on our willingness to allow them to purchase from the United Kingdom. Neutrality was not a possible option for Her Majesty's government at that time. We might have been able to declare ourselves neutral if one independent country was fighting another. But this was not a possible attitude when a Commonwealth country with which we had long and close ties was faced with internal revolt. What would other Commonwealth countries have thought? After all, some other Commonwealth countries face dissident minorities who may be tempted to break up their countries to achieve secession. I come to the question of whether, if we were cut off our supply of defense equipment unilaterally, a peace agreement would be made more likely. We would, I believe, lose our capacity to influence the federal government if we were to take such a step. An especially articulate statement of the opposing case came from Stanley Enig, an academic political scientist and Labour MP. Stanley Enig, I want to put three essential questions. They are essential to what is being done in our name, which is something I bitterly regret. The first is the legal question. By what right do we claim to judge what should happen in Nigeria and what is or is not good for the Nigerian people? My right honorable friend, the Foreign Secretary, had told us that the aim of all of us is one Nigeria. Why? If the Nigerians want 1, 2, 3, or 10 Nigerias, it may be a matter of regret, but it is their business, not ours. Secondly, there is the political question. Why have we made the choice that we have made? Why have one Nigeria as against 2 Nigerias, or the right of secession? Would it not have been better for us to have declared neutrality to show that we were not involved? Finally, there is the moral question. We have supplied arms in order to get influence. That policy has failed. We have no influence, but the war is spreading. It may be that we could stop the war now by ceasing to supply arms. But is it a moral position for British socialist governments, whom I support, to be supplying arms for use in a civil war by men to kill each other, and for that government to say, when this is over, we have bandages and food for you, and we shall give you aid and patch you up again? Harold Wilson was in no doubt as to the strength of feeling in the country against his government's decision to supply arms to the federal side. The thought of their government being responsible for Biafran death was anathema to the British people, who were already the most vocal critics of America in the Vietnam War, then in progress. Wilson knew that if Biafra went to the votes, his government would be defeated, which would bring an end to his administration. To avoid this outcome, he made sure that there would be no vote on the matter. But the pro-Biafrans decided to organize a vote, and since many government supporters had gone home, expecting that there would be no vote, it became clear that we could be defeated. In these circumstances, the Undersecretary, Bill Whitlock, was instructed by the whips to talk out the debate. That is, not to sit down just in time for a division to be called. There were not enough dissidents to carry a closure motion. His action further intensified the anger of those of our people and of the conservatives who supported the Biafran line. In the evening, as I was dealing with papers before going off to resume my holiday, there were sounds of great commotion in Downing Street. A large group of Biafran students, after a protest meeting in North London, had surprised the police by converging on Downing Street, where they lit an enormous bonfire, which was kept going by petrol. It could easily have caused damage, but they then suddenly rushed the door of number 10, surprising the custodians and almost succeeding in entering in strength. In the mood they were in, who knows what damage they would have done? But enough custodians just managed to get their shoulders to the door to hold it and lock it. From that day on, the front door defenses were strengthened. Wow. So the Biafran students, the Igbo students and others in London at the time actually protested enough that they attempted to break into Downing Street, the seat of government. It's like breaking into Washington. That was how serious the reaction towards the Biafran war was on record. The international community, while the federal government side could count on British government support, the Biafrans were largely on their own. Conflicted between sympathies flown from its own war of independence from the British Empire and its special relationship with Britain, and also his own war in Vietnam, the United States, under President Lyndon Johnson, adopted a position of strict neutrality and imposed an embargo on the supply of arms to both sides. The Soviet Union, which might have been expected to support the Biafrans, took the side of the federal government alongside the British. The decision is to be understood in the context of the USSR's own vulnerability to dissident minorities who might wish to secede. The attempt by a new government in Czechoslovakia to introduce liberal reforms in early 1968 was a secession from the communist order. In all but name, which was crushed by Soviet troops, invaded Czechoslovakia on 20th August 1968, just days before the House of Commons debates on Biafra. Recognizing that Nigeria was a major sphere of British influence, which they stood lying little chance of pricing away, the USSR was content to take a purely commercial position on the war. They would supply the federal government with the warplanes and bombs, which the British government had drawn the line against supplying. Any moral credit the British government might have earned for this stand was, however, lost by the interest-free loan which it made available to the federal government to acquire these weapons from the Soviets, and also by the decision to maintain all other war supplies. The only support the Biafrans found was from the French, with Biafra sharing a border with French Cameroon, which itself adjoined French Equatorial Guinea and oil-rich Gabon. The prospect of decoupling the oil-rich region from Nigeria through a low-risk proxy war was attractive to General de Gaulle's France. At the very least, French support for Biafra could be a useful bargaining tool, it stopped short of formally recognizing Biafra as an independent state. Inside Biafra, even after the mass murder of the Igbos in the pogroms, support for secession from Nigeria was far from unanimous amongst Igbos. The Leave camp were not helped by how the people had been forced to consider the secession option in extremis, and a leadership had had no time to develop a considered exit plan. There was, therefore, a strong Remain camp who advocated reconciliation with Nigeria, especially in the early days before the fighting began. The Remainers were bolstered by the several non-Igbo ethnic minorities who found themselves on the Biafran side by reason only of the accident of geography that placed their homelands in the old eastern region. These were the people of areas marked out for special attention back in the Willinkins report, and their position would be heavily emphasized by the Commonwealth Under-Secretary William Whitlock in the House of Commons debate. So Whitlock said, "It must be remembered that the pipelines, the oil installations, and the ports of the eastern region are mainly in the non-Igbo tribal areas. Thus, Colonel Ojukwu's concept of a separate state for Biafra could be achieved only by subordinating the wishes and interest of 5 million non-Igbos to those of the 7 million Igbos in the region. If Colonel Ojukwu were to succeed in his aim, he and the Igbos would acquire for themselves a territory rich in agriculture and containing the great oil installations and reserves. All this at the expense of Nigeria as a whole, financing the war effort. With no foreign help to rely upon, the Biafrans were forced to rely upon themselves. The war effort was to throw up the best and the worst of their people. The responsibility for getting the People's Army to at least look like a fighting force fell on Timothy Chukwuemeka Modu, the Nigerian country representative for Blackwell Young and Company Limited, a City of London-based company, and the official buying agent for the Biafran government. Blackwell's role produced the paradox that the British were supplying both sides in the war. Shell Petroleum Corporation, too, was not to be left out in the double act. Shell, though hit on its production side, made a killing in sales to the chagrin of its competitors in Nigeria. It won the lucrative contract of supplying the Federal Armed Forces. Then, through a complicated operation run from The Hague, it supplied the bulk of the aviation fuel for the relief and gun-running airlifts into Biafra via Sao Tome and Libreville. The relief organizations and the Biafrans settled their accounts in dollars through a Paris bank. Precisely when preparations for war began on the Biafran side, it's not clear, but there is evidence that it started soon after the third and bloodiest round of pogroms on 29 September 1966. An undated secret letter from Mr. T.C. Modu to Major General Philip F. Young, Chief of Staff, Biafran Army, discussing military ID cards to be produced by BWISE in both silver and gold letters, talked in terms of our possible intake of these identity cards to a total number of 30,000 and 30,000 yards of olive green khaki materials. An invoice from Blackwell's dated 12th January 1967 for £13,500 in respect of 60,000 pairs of black ankle boots, grained chrome leather uppers, direct molded sole and heel, vulcanized rubber, number P45, as sample Bewise brand, was addressed to store officer, Nigerian Air Force, Ogun, Nigeria, as opposed to the Biafran Army. Another intrusion to Modu, dated the 21st February 1967, from the Secretary to the Government of Eastern Nigeria, approves the procurement of 3,000 blankets and 6,000 pairs of socks with reinforced heels and toes at prices plus or minus, £30 and, £5, per pair, respectively, and gives an indication of the sense of imminence of war with the notes, I would urge that your overseas principals be pressed to take prompt action on the order, as the blankets and socks are urgently required by government. An order for 10,000 steel helmets, machetes, jerry cans, ponchos, binoculars, compasses, officers' uniforms and swords, military watches, belt caps, and buttons followed in April 1967. To secure the supply lines to Biafra, in the face of a trade embargo now placed against the territory by the federal government, on the 5th of June 1967, Blackwell's issued a new certificate in respect of Modu, now designating him as a sales agent for this company in West Africa rather than Nigeria, stating that it is necessary for him to visit our offices from time to time to discuss and negotiate business. The start of the fighting was precipitated by a tug of war between the federal side and the Biafrans over £7 million of oil receipts that were due to be paid by Shell British Petroleum for the first half of 1967. In a classical legal conundrum, both sides claimed ownership. What was at stake was not only vital resources for the war efforts, but also, because of the British government stakes in British Petroleum, tacit political recognition of whichever side the money was paid to. An Aburi-type meeting to broker a compromise between the competing claims was held in New York at the end of June 1967. The Biafrans put forward a suggestion that 57.5% of the revenues deriving from operations in the East should be paid to the Biafran government by Ojuku's deadline of 1st July. The rest should go into a suspense account pending a political settlement. The companies agreed, but the Nigerians flatly rejected it. They went further. Any attempt by the companies to deny the federal government its normal revenues would be countered with an extension of the blockade to tankers and the terminal at Boni. The industry, the Nigerians warned, would grind to a halt, with Biafrans threatening to stop all oil production on their territory. The British oil companies agreed to make a token payment of £250,000 to them. The federal side reacted by imposing a full blockade on 2nd July 1967, and the fighting started 4 days later. In the meantime, the £250,000 pledged to the Biafrans went missing within the international payment system. So, but one mystery remained. What had happened to the token payment of £250,000? Stanley Gray had written a letter to Ojukwu, which was delivered on the 1st July, promising him the money, but stressing that he was acting under duress. The Biafrans originally asked that it should be paid into the African Continental Bank in London, where they had their main UK account. However, they suddenly changed their minds, probably fearing an attempt by the Nigerians to recover it through legal action, and gave instruction for it to be paid into a numbered account in Geneva. The money never arrived. The Bank of England, presumably instructed by the Treasury, that is, the British government, refused exchange control permission, and the money was frozen. Isolated, landlocked, and now shackled by a crippling trade embargo, all that the Biafrans had to fight for was survival. A letter dated 26 August 1967 from Modu to the general manager of the African Continental Bank in London reported that there are thousands and thousands of people enlisting themselves in the army, militia, and civil defense. The news which BBC have been carrying about the capture of places in Biafra is completely false. The reality of Biafra's existence as a country was confirmed by the content of a letter from the Enugu branch of Azikiwe's the African Continental Bank to his London branch dated 14th September 1967. The word Nigeria in the address had been overtyped and replaced by the word Biafra. And somewhat ironically, the telegraphic address for the bank was Zik Bank. The letter reported an adverse turn of events that London's Midland Bank has refused to add their confirmation to the letter of credit established in favor of Messrs. Blackwell Young and Company Limited on account of the present Malays besetting our republic. So what the Biafrans lacked in financial resources and weaponry, they made up for it gallantly. They made up for in gallantry and a highly effective international media campaign. The daily television images of the suffering of Biafran women and children from the combined efforts of the policy of starvation and bombing caught the imagination of the British people. Their biggest handicap, however, was the presence in their midst of so many who were not committed to the cause, but who found themselves on the Biafran side of the front by accident or by the design of the Federals. Harold Smith offered the following insights into the roles of Francis Nwo Kedi. The Eastern Treasury was taken over and Francis Nwo Kedi was dispatched by Colonel Ojukwu, the Biafran leader, to travel abroad buying arms. Francis was an extremely efficient and highly experienced former head of the Foreign Service. So that what purportedly happened seems extraordinary. It appears that very few arms were obtained for the very large sums of money taken out of Biafra. It was claimed that Francis and his mission were duped by unscrupulous arms dealers. $20 million of foreign exchange were rapidly depleted in dubious deals. Yet, those involved were the cream of Nigeria's civil service. $20 million was an awful lot of duping. The Nigerian government responded by canceling Nwo Kedi's passports and belatedly trying to stop the flow of currency from the East. Francis had once been the dutiful advisor to the British, and then after independence, to the British-backed northern rulers of Nigeria.